The ink on the deed needs to be dry before we get back from the honeymoon, Art. After that, honestly, we'd prefer if you found a cheap condo closer to the highway. Toby doesn't have the heart to tell you, but you're a third wheel in your own house now. Sloane didn't raise her voice. She didn't even stop buttering her sourdough. She just slid the prenuptial agreement across my clean pine kitchen table, her diamond catching the morning light like a warning flare. She had no idea that Toby was still out in the driveway, struggling with a rusted bolt on my lawnmower. She also had no idea that before she ever set foot in this valley, I had spent 34 years as a lead derailment investigator for the National Transportation Safety Board. My entire career was built on finding the microscopic cracks in heavy steel that everyone else missed. The tiny, invisible pockets of trapped gas that sit quiet for decades under the weight of 1,000-ton coal trains until, one day, they finally give way and tear the whole world apart. People, I've learned, have those exact same microfractures. My name is Art Vance. I'm 64 years old, and until that rainy Tuesday, I believed the hardest thing to inspect was a bent rail under a 100-car freight train. I was dead wrong. The hardest thing to inspect is a human being who has spent years perfecting a lie. Toby came inside a minute later, wiping grease off his forehead with the back of his hand. He was 31, built like a brick wall from his years of doing custom metal fabrication, but he still had that same trusting, open-mouthed smile he'd had since he was 6. "Hey," Toby said, looking between us. "Everything good in here?" "Perfect, babe," Sloane said. Her voice changed instantly, sweeter, softer, like warm honey. "I was just telling your dad how much we appreciate him letting us use his attorney to double-check the boilerplate stuff." She smiled at me, her eyes completely dead. I didn't say a word. I just folded the document, slipped it into my back pocket, and went back to my black coffee. It had all started 5 months earlier. Toby had been single for 3 years, buried in his work at the fabrication shop, when Sloane Prescott literally blew into his life. She'd brought a vintage iron gate to his shop, claiming she needed it restored for an estate she was decorating. She was smart, funny, and knew exactly how to make a quiet man feel like the center of the universe. Within 3 months, they were engaged. I'd tried to be happy for him, but when you spend your life looking at wreckage, you develop a sense for things that are too perfect. When a train derailment happens, the untrained eye sees a sudden, violent catastrophe. I see a sequence of events that started 6 months ago, 300 miles back down the track. The morning after Sloane slid that prenup across my table, I took it to my old workspace in the basement. I turned on the overhead fluorescent lamp and read every single line. Most of it was standard legal language, but buried on page 14, under a section innocently titled Shared Physical Capital and Future Caretaking, was a clause that made me stop cold. It stated that if Toby's primary residence, which was currently listed as my property, was transferred to his name prior to the marriage, it would immediately become a joint marital asset, exempt from standard premarital exclusion in the event of a dissolution lasting less than 36 months. The legal jargon was slick, but the math was simple. She wanted my house, and she'd already convinced Toby that I was going to sign it over to him as an early wedding present. I didn't call Toby. Instead, I called Mick Devlin. Mick was a retired state trooper who ran a private investigative outfit out of a cluttered office behind a transmission shop in South Denver. He didn't have a glossy website, and he smelled like stale tobacco and wet gravel, but he knew how to find things that people had spent a lifetime burying. "Art," Mick said when I walked in, tossing his jacket onto a folding chair, "you look like you just found a broken tie on a high-speed line." "Maybe I did," I said. I laid the prenup on his desk alongside a photo of Sloane and Toby laughing at a local street festival. "Find out who she is, Mick. Not who she says she is. The real one." Mick looked at the photo, then at the document. "Give me a week. And Art, don't look at her different when she's around. People like this can smell suspicion from a mile away." For the next 7 days, I played the part of the doting, slightly slow-witted father. I helped Toby organize the catering lists. I sat through agonizing discussions about flower arrangements. I even let Sloane choose a new color for the living room walls, watching her touch the old wooden trim with a look of pure, hungry calculation. Then, on a damp Friday afternoon, my phone rang. "Art," Mick's voice was flat, "I'm down at the Bluebird Diner on Colfax. You need to get down here. Now." I didn't ask questions. I got in my truck and drove. When I walked into the diner, Mick was sitting in a corner booth, staring at a small digital camera. He didn't look up until I sat down opposite him. Without a word, he turned the camera around and pushed the playback button. The screen showed Sloane. She was sitting in a silver Mercedes SUV in the far corner of a gravel parking lot near the river. Beside her was a man in his mid-40s, sharp-featured, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that looked out of place in this part of town. They weren't talking, they were kissing. It wasn't a quick, affectionate peck. It was the heavy, desperate contact of two people who had been doing this for a very long time. "Who is he?" I asked, my blood turning to ice. "Julian Croft," Mick said, pulling a greasy manila folder from his bag. "High-end commercial real estate developer. Works out of Cherry Creek. Here's where it gets interesting, Art. Sloane's real name isn't Sloane Prescott. It's Sloane Croft. Or at least, it was until 3 years ago." I stared at him. "They're married?" "No," Mick said, tapping the folder. "They're divorced, on paper anyway. But they've shared 3 different addresses over the last 6 years under 4 different names. And Julian has been the buyer or the listing agent on 3 separate properties that Sloane acquired through divorce settlements from 3 other guys." He opened the folder, revealing a series of public records, court dockets, and bank statements. 6 years ago, she married a custom cabinet maker in Fort Collins named Gavin Reyes, Mick explained, pointing to a copy of a marriage certificate. 18 months later, she divorced him. Part of the settlement included his grandfather's workshop. She sold it 3 weeks later. The buyer? A shell company owned by Julian Croft. 4 years ago, she did the exact same thing to a guy named Nate Sterling, who owned a small precision tooling company in Boulder. Same pattern, same quick-turn divorce, same fire sale of his business assets to Julian. I looked at the photos of Toby on my phone. Toby, who spent 12 hours a day covered in soot and metal filings, proud of every weld he made. "She's not just cheating on him," I whispered. "This is a demolition derby." "It's a business model," Mick corrected. "Your son is the 3rd stop on the tour, Art. And your house, along with Toby's fabrication shop, is the prize." My hands shook, just a little. I took a deep breath, forcing the NTSB investigator back to the surface. When a train derails, anger doesn't fix the track. Logic does. "Does Toby know Julian?" I asked. "No," Mick said. "Julian's been playing the role of her distant cousin who handles her investments from afar. He's the one who suggested the specific wording in that prenup." I closed the folder. "I need more than photos, Mick. If I show Toby these pictures, she'll tell him it's an old friend, or that she was saying goodbye, or that I'm a paranoid old man who can't let go of his wife's memory. He'll believe her because he wants to." "I know," Mick said. "That's why we're going to find Gavin Reyes." The next morning, I drove 90 miles north to a small, dusty town outside of Greeley. Gavin Reyes didn't have a workshop anymore. He was working out of a rented bay behind an agricultural supply warehouse, repairing rusted tractor parts. He looked 50, though his record said he was 38. His eyes were bloodshot, and his knuckles were scarred from years of hard, cheap labor. When I told him why I was there, he didn't get angry. He just sat down on a stack of old tires and laughed, a dry, hollow sound that made my stomach turn. "She's doing it again, huh?" Gavin said, wiping his face with a greasy rag. "Let me guess. She's real quiet when she's thinking, but when she talks, she makes you feel like you're the smartest guy in the room. She told your boy that they're a team, right? That they don't need anyone else?" "She told him they need to secure their future," I said. Gavin shook his head. "She took everything I had, man. My grandfather built that shop in '46. I had 5 guys working for me. By the time Sloane got through with the court proceedings, my lawyers told me it would cost more to fight her than to just sign the deed over. Julian Croft bought it for pennies on the dollar. They had it listed for 3 times that before the ink on our divorce was even dry." He reached into a rusty metal toolbox, pulled out a thick stack of faded legal documents, and handed them to me. "Keep them," Gavin said. "I don't want to look at them anymore. But tell your boy, tell him that if he marries her, he's not just losing his shop. He's losing his mind. I spent 2 years in a bottle because of her. Don't let him do that." I drove back to Denver with Gavin's legal records sitting on the passenger seat like a live bomb. That evening, Toby came over to my house to help me clean up the garage. We worked in silence for an hour, the hum of the old radio the only sound between us. He was quiet, his mind clearly somewhere else. "Dad," he said finally, setting down a heavy box of old steel gears. Sloan wants us to have a talk. About the house. What about it, son? I asked, keeping my voice level. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking down at his boots. She thinks it's better if we put the property in my name before the wedding, for tax purposes. She says her cousin Julian can set up a family trust so we don't get hit with the massive inheritance tax later on. I looked at him, my only son, the boy I'd raised alone since my wife Sarah died when he was 12. He had her eyes, her stubborn kindness. And what do you think, Toby? I don't know, he said softly. It feels fast, Dad. But she's so smart about this stuff. She's just trying to protect us. She says you're getting older, and if something happens to you, the state will take half of what we've built. Toby, I said, stepping closer to him. Do you trust me? Of course I do, Dad. What kind of question is that? I want you to let Sloan and her cousin Julian handle the paperwork, I said. Tell them I'll sign whatever they need on Monday. But tell them we'll do it at the lawyer's office. Together. Toby's face cleared, a look of immense relief washing over him. Seriously?
Thanks, Dad. I knew you'd understand.
Sloan was worried you'd think she was trying to push you out. No, I said, my heart breaking a little at the honesty in his voice. I don't think she's trying to push me out at all. On Sunday night, I met with Clara Thorne. Clara was a sharp, 60-year-old asset protection attorney who had represented the railroad union for 30 years. She didn't use fancy offices or expensive jargon. She just knew the law like the back of her hand. She read through the documents Gavin Reyes had given me, then compared them to the new transfer deed Sloan's cousin Julian had sent over for me to sign. It's a classic squeeze, Art, Clara said, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. This deed doesn't just transfer the house to Toby, it transfers it to a newly created LLC called Vance and Croft Holdings. If you sign this, you aren't giving your son a gift. You're giving 40% of your property to Julian Croft's Shell Corporation the second the marriage certificate is filed. Can we stop it? I asked. Legally? Easily, Clara said. We just don't sign. But if we do that now, Sloan will simply spin a story to Toby. They'll get married in some courthouse anyway, and she'll find another way to bleed him dry over the next 3 years. If you want to save your son, you have to let them think they've won. You have to let them walk right into the trap they built. We spent the next 4 hours drafting a very different set of documents. Clara called it a conditional trust with a structural trigger. On the surface, it looked identical to the paperwork Julian had sent over, but deep within the legal footnotes, we placed a tiny, devastating microfracture of our own. Monday morning was bright and cold. We met at a small glass-walled conference room in Cherry Creek. Sloan arrived first, looking flawless in a cream-colored pantsuit, followed by Julian Croft, who shook my hand with the practiced warmth of a politician. Art, Julian said, his smile radiating confidence. Great to finally meet you. Sloan's told me so much about your career. It's an honor. Just doing my job, Julian, I said, sitting down. Toby sat next to Sloan, looking slightly uncomfortable in a collared shirt. He kept reaching over to squeeze her hand, his face filled with a quiet, desperate hope that everything would go smoothly. Clara Thorne sat at the head of the table, her face completely expressionless. She slid the modified documents across the glass. These have been updated to reflect the family trust structure, Clara said, her voice dry as dust. We've included the specific clauses regarding the transfer of the primary residence to the LLC upon the solemnization of the marriage. Julian picked up the documents, his eyes scanning the pages with rapid, professional ease. He stopped at page 12, then page 15, his fingers tapping against the edge of the paper. Everything looks correct, Julian said, looking up at Sloan with a barely perceptible nod. We appreciate your cooperation, Art. This is the best way to ensure Toby and Sloan have a secure foundation. I agree, I said. I picked up the heavy black pen Clara had placed in front of me. I looked at Toby, who was watching me with wet eyes. For you, son, I said. I signed the deed. Sloan's breath caught in her throat for just a fraction of a second. The look of pure, victorious hunger that crossed her face was gone in an instant, replaced by her usual soft smile. But I saw it. I saw the micro crack widen.
Thank you, Walter,
she said, using my legal first name for the first time. You won't regret this. I'm sure I won't, I said. The wedding was scheduled for the following Saturday at a restored historic lodge in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Over the next 5 days, Mick Devlin didn't sleep. He followed Sloan and Julian everywhere. We needed the final piece of the puzzle, the smoking gun that would prove, beyond any legal or emotional doubt, what their actual plan was. On Thursday night, Mick called me from a parked car outside a high-end steakhouse in downtown Denver. "They're celebrating, Art," Mick said, his voice tense. "They're in a private booth in the back. I've got a directional mic pointed right at their glass. You're going to want to hear this." He played the audio through the phone receiver. The quality was scratchy, but the voices were crystal clear. "He actually signed it?" Julian's voice was filled with disbelief and a quiet, nasty laugh. "Like a lamb," Sloan replied. "He's just an old, lonely man who wants his son to be happy. He's completely clueless. We'll wait 6 months after the wedding. Then we'll start the irreconcilable differences routine. By next winter, we'll have the shop and the land listed. We'll clear at least $800,000 after taxes." "And Toby?" "Toby's a sweet idiot," Sloan said, her voice dripping with contempt. "But he's boring. I can't spend another year pretending to care about custom welding and his mother's old quilts. Once we get the signature on the joint bank accounts this weekend, we're golden." I sat in my dark kitchen, listening to her talk about my son like he was a piece of scrap metal to be melted down and sold. "Did you get the recording, Mick?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "Every single word, Art. It's digital, time-stamped, and backed up on 3 different drives." "Good," I said. "Keep your suit clean for Saturday.
We've got a wedding to attend."
Saturday afternoon was breathtakingly beautiful. The pine trees around the lodge were dusted with fresh snow, and the sky was a deep, sharp blue. Nearly 100 guests filled the chapel, laughing and drinking champagne. Toby stood near the altar in a dark gray suit, looking more handsome than I'd ever seen him. He was pacing, his hands clenching and unclenching, the nervous energy radiating off him in waves. Sloan walked down the aisle in a stunning white lace gown, her arm linked with Julian Croft, who was playing the role of the proud family member giving her away. I sat in the front row, my leather briefcase resting flat against my knees. I didn't look at Sloan. I looked at Toby. The ceremony was short, professional, and entirely hollow. When the minister asked if anyone had cause why they shouldn't be wed, I kept my hand flat on the leather of my briefcase. The micro crack wasn't ready to give way yet. You don't stop the train before it hits the bad rail. You let the derailment happen in a controlled environment where you can contain the wreckage. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said. The crowd erupted in applause. Sloan turned to Toby, kissing him with a look of pure, triumphant joy. Over his shoulder, her eyes met mine. She gave me a tiny, mocking nod. The reception held in the main lodge was loud and warm. People drank, danced, and congratulated the happy couple. Toby looked exhausted but relieved, holding Sloane's hand as they walked from table to table. At exactly 8 p.m., while the band was taking a break, I stood up and walked to the microphone at the front of the room. "Excuse me, everyone," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the speakers. "If I could have your attention for just a few minutes." The room quieted down. Toby smiled warmly, expecting a standard sentimental father-of-the-groom speech. Sloan settled into her chair, her hand resting on Julian's arm at the head table. "As many of you know," I began, looking around the room, "my wife Sarah and I raised Toby in the house we built with our own hands. That house represents 30 years of hard work, love, and sacrifice. And when Toby met Sloan, I wanted nothing more than for them to have that same foundation." Sloan smiled, leaning her head against Toby's shoulder. "That's why, last Monday, I signed a transfer deed giving up my sole ownership of that property," I continued. A quiet murmur of appreciation went through the crowd. "But before I did that," I said, my tone shifting, becoming cold and precise as a steel blade, "I had to do my job. You see, when a train derails, you don't look at the big explosion. You look for the hidden defect. And sometimes you find a defect that has been running on different tracks for years." Sloane's smile froze. She sat up a little straighter, her eyes narrowing as she looked at me. "I'd like to introduce a few friends of mine who traveled quite a long way to be here tonight," I said. From the back of the room, Mick Devlin stood up. Beside him stood Gavin Reyes, wearing a clean but ill-fitting suit, and another man, Nate Sterling, the small business owner from Boulder whom Sloan had ruined 4 years ago. Sloan's face went completely white. She looked at Gavin, then at Nate, her breath catching so hard I could hear it from 15 feet away. "What is this?" Julian Croft muttered, standing up from the table. "Art, you've had too much to drink. Sit down." "Toby," I said, ignoring Julian completely. "I need you to come up here, son." Toby looked confused, his eyes darting from me to Sloane's terrified face, then to the two strangers standing at the back of the room. "Dad, what's going on?" "Just come here, Toby," I said softly. He stood up slowly, walking toward the stage. Sloane reached out to grab his arm, her fingers curling like talons into his jacket, but he pulled away, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. When Toby reached the stage, I opened my briefcase and took out the first evidence binder. I didn't hand it to him. I laid it on the podium and turned on the auxiliary audio system that Mick had patched into the house speakers. "This is a recording from Thursday night," I said. I pressed play. Sloane's voice boomed through the lodge, clear and undeniable. "He's just an old, lonely man who wants his son to be happy. We'll wait 6 months after the wedding. Then we'll start the irreconcilable differences routine. By next winter, we'll have the shop and the land listed. Toby's a sweet idiot." The entire room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the hardwood floor. Toby froze, his eyes staring at the speakers as if they were speaking a foreign language. He shook his head, his hands beginning to tremble. "No, that's not..." He turned around to look at Sloane. She was standing now, her eyes wild, her face stripped of all its polished beauty. "Toby, it's a fake. It's a deep fake. Your dad, he's sick, Toby. He's trying to destroy us because he's alone." Julian Croft stepped forward, his voice loud and aggressive. "This is harassment. We're calling the police. Get this old bastard out of here." "Call them, Julian." Mick Devlin's voice boomed from the back of the room. He walked down the center aisle, holding up a badge and a stack of certified legal documents. "Because while you're at it, you can explain to the IRS why your shell company, Vance and Croft Holdings, has been using the same fraudulent routing numbers that were flagged in the Gavin Reyes asset forfeiture case in 46. Gavin Reyes took a step forward, looking directly at Sloane. "Remember me, Sloane? You told me I was a sweet idiot, too, right before you took my grandfather's shop." Toby looked at the documents on the podium. He saw the marriage certificates. He saw the photos of Sloane and Julian kissing in the back of the Mercedes. He saw the financial transfer logs showing the exact flow of cash from her previous victims directly into Julian Croft's commercial accounts. He didn't scream. He didn't yell. He just looked at Sloane, and in that moment, I watched the last bit of youth and blind trust leave my son's eyes. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to watch in my entire life. "Toby," Sloane whispered, stepping toward him, her hands reaching out. "Baby, please, we can talk about this. It's not what it looks like." "Is that your voice?" Toby asked. His voice was incredibly quiet, but it cut through the room like a physical blow. "Toby, listen to me." "Is that your voice, Sloane?" he roared, the sound of his pain shaking the light fixtures overhead. She stopped. She looked at him, then at me, then at the room full of staring, disgusted faces. The mask finally broke. The soft, sweet girl she'd played for 5 months vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating professional who had stripped 2 other men of their lives. She sneered, her shoulders dropping as she let out a sharp, ugly laugh. "Yeah," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "It's my voice. So what? You signed the deed, Art. It's done. The house is ours. You think some little recording is going to stand up in court against the signed and notarized transfer of property? We own 40% of everything you have. Try to fight it. It'll take you 5 years and every dime you have left to even get us in front of a judge." Julian Croft smiled, adjusting his cufflinks. "She's right, Art. You played right into our hands. The law doesn't care about your feelings. It cares about signatures." I looked at Julian, then at Sloan. And for the first time all night, I smiled. "You're right, Julian," I said. "The law cares about signatures, and it also cares about the specific clauses within a contract." Clara Thorne stood up from her table, holding up a copy of the deed I'd signed on Monday. "If you had read page 19 of the updated transfer agreement," Clara said, her voice ringing with professional satisfaction, "you would have noticed a standard structural safety clause. It states that the transfer of the primary residence to Vance and Croft Holdings is contingent upon the uncontested legal standing of the marriage for a period of no less than 90 days. In the event of a material misrepresentation of civil status, such as the failure to disclose prior fraud judgments, the deed is automatically nullified, and the property reverts entirely to the sole ownership of Arthur Vance." She looked at Sloan, her eyes glittering. "And since Mr. Reyes and Mr. Sterling filed a joint civil fraud petition against you in district court at exactly 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, the transfer you signed on Monday is already legally dead." Julian's smile vanished. He grabbed the documents from Sloane's hand, his eyes frantically scanning the pages until he found the clause on page 19. His face went gray. You bastard," Julian whispered, looking up at me. "I spent 34 years looking for cracks, Julian," I said, stepping down from the stage. "And you two are the biggest structural defects I've ever seen." Toby walked slowly toward the head table. He picked up the heavy gold wedding band he'd put on his finger just an hour before. He didn't throw it. He just dropped it into Sloane's half-empty champagne glass with a soft, metallic clink. "Get out of my sight," Toby said. Sloane looked at him, her eyes burning with a mixture of rage and desperation. But she knew she'd lost. She grabbed her designer bag, turned on her heel, and marched out of the lodge, her white dress dragging through the snow as Julian followed her in frantic silence. The room remained quiet for a long moment. Then, one by one, the guests began to leave, offering quiet, awkward condolences as they passed. Within an hour, the lodge was empty. Toby sat at one of the circular tables, his head resting in his hands. The fire in the hearth was dying down, casting long, flickering shadows across the empty room. I walked over and sat down beside him. I didn't say anything. I just laid my hand on his shoulder, feeling the deep, ragged breaths he was drawing. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I was so stupid. I wanted to believe her so bad." "You weren't stupid, Toby," I said softly. "You're an honest man, and honest people don't expect others to be professional thieves. That's not your fault." He looked up at me, his eyes red and wet. "You could have stopped it before the wedding, Dad. Why did you let it go this far?" "Because if I'd told you 3 weeks ago, you would have hated me for it," I said honestly. "You would have thought I was just an old, bitter man who didn't want you to leave. You had to see the crack yourself, Toby. You had to see the bridge fail with your own eyes so you'd know never to walk on it again." He looked at me for a long time, then slowly nodded. He reached over and squeezed my hand, the same rough, grease-stained hand that had worked alongside mine for 20 years. "Thanks, Dad," he said. It's been 6 months since that night. The house in the valley still stands. We didn't sell it. Instead, Toby and I spent the winter rebuilding the old workshop in the backyard, replacing the rotted sill plates and reinforcing the main support beams until they were stronger than the day they were put in. Sloane and Julian Croft are currently facing a federal grand jury investigation for interstate wire fraud and asset restructuring. McDevlin's files were more than enough to get the state attorney general interested, and once they started digging into Julian's shell companies, the whole house of cards collapsed. Toby still has hard days. Trust doesn't come back all at once. It's a slow, quiet process of rebuilding, one honest day at a time. But every Saturday morning, he still drives up my driveway, climbs out of his truck, and helps me with the chores. Sometimes, the people who love you the most are the ones who have to let you see the wreckage so you can learn how to build something that will never fall down.